session of the Bitcoin 101 series for this year. Next year, we're going to do a few more sessions. So we're going to cover things like the Lightning Network, look at central bank digital currencies, and various other topics in the Bitcoin space. But this is kind of the session that we've been building up to in terms of what you might end up doing if you feel like Bitcoin is something you'd like to get into now. So it's buying Bitcoin and storing it safely. Hopefully everything that's kind of led up to this point will give you a clear understanding of what Bitcoin is and how it works, and some confidence about the mechanics of it. And then if you feel like you want to buy it, this hopefully will give you some understanding of what the good process is, good practice is in that regard. So I just wanted to start off with a quote from Satoshi Nakamoto. He basically made this comment with regards to the creation of Bitcoin, shall we say. The root problem with conventional currency is all the trust that's required to make it work. The central bank must be trusted not to debase the currency, but the history of fiat currency is full of breaches of that trust. Banks must be trusted to hold our money, transfer it electronically, but they lend it out in waves of credit bubbles with barely a fraction in reserve. We have to trust them with our privacy and trust them not to let identity thieves drain our accounts. And that really is the root, I think, of why Bitcoin was created, because there are genuine problems with the way that the financial system works at a macro level, but also at an individual user level. Your data is very easily compromised, and you're very easily financially censored, I should say, as well. So what we're going to cover on today's agenda, so we're going to look briefly at global wealth and how that relates to Bitcoin, the fiat versus the Bitcoin standard, options for storing Bitcoin, so the different ways that you can actually store it, exchanges. We're going to cover what not your keys, not your coins means, different storing options, so a bit more detail on each of those options. Seed phrases, passphrases, and pins, very important section. And then a brief walk through a wallet setup so you can see what that actually looks like in real life. So global wealth, it's very difficult to get a definitive number of global wealth, but I think it's interesting when we talk about Bitcoin in the context of it being finite in amount. There are various different estimates, and it depends how you measure wealth. So, for example, you can look at all the cash in the world. You might include property and other assets. You might include derivatives. There are lots of ways of calculating wealth. This particular one I just took from an article that I found in the Sun newspaper in the UK, but it's dated from 2020. And it says there is currently around 36.8 trillion in its simplest calculating form, known as narrow money. This includes notes, coins, as well as easily accessed funds. But this figure reaches a staggering 90.4 trillion if you consider broad money, which includes savings, ISAs, or fixed term accounts. So that's essentially like all of those would be included when a calculation is done for the whole of global wealth for 2020. So what's interesting to look at with that is if you divide that number by the amount of Bitcoin that there are. So let's imagine that we move to a Bitcoin standard across the globe. If you divide 90.4 trillion by 21 million Bitcoin, then that would make the value of each Bitcoin in today's money 4.3 million US dollars. So I just thought that was an interesting number to point out, because people often try and understand what the value might be of Bitcoin. The assumption here is that we are on a Bitcoin standard globally, which we're obviously not. We're on a US dollar standard, but that would be the number if we were on a Bitcoin standard. This is a fantastic graphic that I found. It basically shows, I think, in the clearest possible way what the value proposition is of Bitcoin scarcity. So if you take the US dollar, your money divided by infinity, i.e. your money can be divided many, many times and it will become increasingly worthless through money printing. Bitcoin is your money divided by 21 million. So again, I've just repeated this, the 90.4 trillion divided by 21 million would equal 4.3 million. So that would essentially be that calculation in today's money. In reality, what happens is more and more is printed. So this number gets bigger and bigger and bigger in the fiat world. So what are the options for storing Bitcoin? So there are different types of storage methodologies for Bitcoin, and they have different relative benefits and downsides. So you have custodial storage, which basically means somebody does the storing for you. So that's typically an exchange might offer this service, but there are also lots of companies that do custodial services for Bitcoin. You can use software, like software on your computer, or software in a wallet that you would keep on your phone. You can also use cold storage. So that can be a USB device or any kind of device where you can store the keys, or it could even be a piece of paper. So crazy as that sounds, paper is actually cold storage. The other option is a thing called multi-sig, which basically stands for multi-signature. And what that means is that you need multiple parties to sign off on a transaction, and they each hold a piece of the puzzle that would allow that transaction to be signed off and be executed. So essentially, they would all have signing ability for a given wallet, and you would need a certain number of parties to sign in order to execute. You could have 3 parties, you could have 10 parties, you could have 20 parties, and you could have a different number of those needing to do the signature. But that's essentially what a multi-sig means. And again, that has benefits and downsides. So exchanges. So exchanges, when they hold your Bitcoin, they're basically acting in a custodial fashion. So they're custodying not your physical Bitcoin or your actual Bitcoin, because your Bitcoin is distributed across the whole internet across servers. So it doesn't exist in anywhere in tangible. But what they do is they custody your private keys. So the thing to note about exchanges is that they are centralized. In order to access their services, you need to go through a Know Your Customer service. So that's very similar to, for example, how you would if you were opening a bank account. You need to produce a passport and verify who you are. What they're essentially giving you back, so you're not holding your Bitcoin, they're giving you an IOU. So it's like a thing that says, we've got this Bitcoin that we are custodying your keys for, and here's an IOU that says that we owe it back to you. Coinbase were actually very upfront about what this meant, and I think this is really important to note this quote. Because custodially held crypto assets may be considered to be the property of a bankruptcy estate, in the event of a bankruptcy, the crypto assets we hold in custody on behalf of our customers could be subject to bankruptcy proceedings, and such customers could be treated as our general unsecured creditors. So what that means is that if there are bankruptcy proceedings, unlike with your retail account, your retail bank account, those funds or that Bitcoin is not secured as being yours. It's not held in a ring-fenced fashion. And that is the same for all of the exchanges. Binance were just upfront really about explaining how that worked. Not your keys, not your coins. So this is a quote from Bull Bitcoin, which is a Canadian non-custodial service for Bitcoin. So what they say is, custodial services can restrict access to your money, freeze or seize your funds. They keep your transaction data. They are targets for hackers and honeypots for hostile government agencies. Using custodial services defeats the entire purpose of Bitcoin. So Bitcoin was conceived as a peer-to-peer form of digital cash, and its benefits are mainly derived from the fact that you can self-custody it, and therefore you don't have to give up data. You don't have to allow anyone or trust anyone else, rather, to custody those keys for you. So essentially what happens with the keys is the key, your private key, which is what allows you to access the Bitcoin and transact with it, that's held by the exchange or any other custodial service, and you receive an IOU in exchange for that. Hopefully that's clear, but we can cover any questions. So I wanted to bring up the trucker convoy, because this is something that really put Bitcoin somewhat to the test. So what was it? It was GoFundMe, and so GoFundMe had the donations frozen, and I think they eventually returned them to all the donors. And then GiveSendGo was another organization that took donations and then eventually returned them to all the donors as well. But the Bitcoin community tried to support the truckers, or some people in the Bitcoin community tried to support the truckers by giving them access to Bitcoin funds. And the Canadian government essentially froze the bank accounts of people that had been involved in this. And they went out to Bitcoin services and said, we want you to freeze those wallets and sequester those Bitcoin. So Nunchuck is a Canadian non-custodial service, and this was the response that they gave to the Canadian government, which I just thought was helpful in highlighting because it explains really the difference between, I mean, it's somewhat humorous, but it explains the difference between a custodial and a non-custodial service. So what they say is Nunchuck is a self-custodial collaborative multi-sig Bitcoin wallet. So they have multi-sig functionality. Our software is free to use. It allows people to eliminate single points of failure and store Bitcoin in the safest way possible while preserving privacy. We do not hold any keys. Therefore, we cannot freeze our users' assets. We cannot prevent them from being moved. We do not have knowledge of the existence, nature, value, and location of our users' assets. This is by design. Please look up how self-custody and private keys work. This is the humorous bit. When the Canadian dollar becomes worthless, we will be here to serve you too. So that was basically their response to the request to give up the keys, was like, sorry, but we actually can't. That's not how we're structured. So what are the issues, or some of the issues with exchanges? And I want to just say here that they are somewhat necessary evil in the sense that you need an exchange really to on-ramp and off-ramp into Bitcoin. It's very hard to buy Bitcoin if you can't access it through an exchange, or it's harder. And they do provide useful services. The Bitcoin community typically is not super keen on them because they tend to trade in altcoins, and Bitcoiners don't believe that altcoins should be, or that retail users should be exposed to the risks of dealing in kind of tokens that are centralized and not subject to limits on their issuance and so on. But they do have functions. So there was a Bitcoin-based exchange that was one of the first ones that had issues, and that was Mt. Gox. And you'll often hear people in the Bitcoin talking about Mt. Gox. So what happened was very early in the Bitcoin journey, so in 2011, so just a couple of years after the first Bitcoin had been mined, there was an exchange set up called Mt. Gox. They were hacked, and the reason that they were hacked, or how they were hacked, was that the founder of the exchange had a hot wallet, and I will explain later on what hot wallet is, but that's basically where he was storing the funds. So it was a wallet that was connected to the internet, essentially, in very, very brief terms. And that was hacked, and the hacker was draining funds from that wallet, and he didn't notice until much further down the line that this had happened. So about 740,000 Bitcoin were stolen, and this eventually led to the exchange collapsing. A more recent example that everyone's probably fairly familiar with is FTX. So that was essentially fraud. What FTX were doing was they were taking the customer's funds, so the customer's Bitcoin, and using that to fund their investment arm, Alameda. And then Alameda was essentially making a lot of really bad trades and losing a ton of money. And they were also buying up properties in the Bahamas, properties for Sam Bankman-Fried's family, allegedly. There was all sorts of shenanigans going on. One of the central problems with FTX and why this was allowed to happen was the centralization. So in a decentralized context, this wouldn't have been possible. So that's just kind of worth noting, because it's important to realize that this was a problem with decentralization and obviously fraud. They were printing their own tokens. So they had an FTX token and they were holding that as reserves, which is essentially like me or you saying, I'm just going to print or create some imaginary token, some imaginary coin, and I'm just going to put it on the balance sheet of my company and say, this particular token is something of value, which you can see where there might be issues with that. And they also apparently had some, or not apparently, allegedly had some involvement with money laundering via Ukraine. So the Ukrainian government was accepting donations to support the Ukrainian people using the FTX infrastructure, and it's not clear, or there seems to be a lot of suspicion around the fact that that was being used to funnel funds, essentially launder funds from the US through the Ukraine and back to the US. Very lastly, Binance. You've probably seen Binance come up now since the collapse of FTX, so that's been in the news a bit, but that was founded by a guy called Changpeng Zhao. So he originally based it in China, but then China obviously banned Bitcoin, so they banned Bitcoin mining and they banned Bitcoin trading. So he moved the company from China to the Cayman Islands. I mean, they've had a few kind of issues with regulators. So they were banned by UK regulators from doing any regulated activity in the UK. And then they're under investigation by US regulators. And there are lots of rumors now about imminent collapse because people have been trying to validate what their assets are versus their liabilities, and it's unclear whether they're sound or not. So that's the three exchanges. Okay, so if we cover hot wallets. So you can store Bitcoin in a hot wallet, and the reason a hot wallet is something that's connected to the internet. And the reason you might want to do that is for convenience. So if you want to pay for things with Bitcoin using your mobile phone or online, you need it to be in a hot wallet. So you need to be able to connect that up and access services and so on. So it's much more convenient than cold storage. But it obviously comes with its own risks. So you risk the wallet being hacked. You risk potentially like the software of the wallet no longer working. And if you haven't properly backed things up, then you might run into issues there. And you need to essentially manage that security on your own. Anyone that is regularly using Bitcoin probably needs a hot wallet. It'd be very difficult to kind of go about your day to day and pay for things like coffees and so on if you didn't have one. But it's just something to bear in mind that if you are buying a lot of Bitcoin, it's not a safe place to store it. It should really be air gapped between your storage and the internet. So that brings me to cold storage. So that's offline storage, and that can be a device. It can be paper as well. With cold storage, a device generally looks like a USB. And what you are storing on there is not the Bitcoin, you're storing the private keys. And the private keys are what will allow you to access that Bitcoin. What does paper storage look like? So paper storage is essentially your seed phrase and or your passphrase, if you have one. And I'll explain the difference between those later on. But essentially, you would write those on a piece of paper or several pieces of paper or in several booklets, and you would store that in different safe locations. So you might want to do that in a way where you leave something, I don't know, in the safe of a family member who's in another country so that they've got access if they need to for your Bitcoin. And you have a backup in the event that you need to have it. Cold storage offline technically could also just be memorizing your seed phrase in your head, but that's obviously very risky because if you forget it, then you're not going to be able to access that Bitcoin. I've put safe from hacking there. Actually, I think that's probably slightly incorrect. I'd say safer from hacking. And certainly somebody could physically break into your home or physically break into wherever you've got something stored and access that. So I'm not saying that that's necessarily a risk, and it's probably a lower risk than mismanagement or hacking on online storage. But it's just good to be aware of the fact that obviously nothing is entirely safe in that respect. So yeah, you have to manage your own security for your offline storage, but it's probably the safest way to store larger amounts of Bitcoin. Back to multi-sig. So multi-sig, same thing. So several parties have to sign off before the wallet can be accessed and transactions can be executed. So this might be, for example, where you have a group of friends and you decide, okay, there's 5 of us and we share a wallet and it needs 3 of us to sign off on any transactions or access for that wallet. And we all have separate sets of authorizations to access that. There are service providers that do this as well. So this is one of the mitigations of a point of failure. There's an organization, for example, called Casa. I think their Twitter handle is @CasaHodl, HODL, CASAHODL. And they offer a service whereby, for example, let's say there are 3 or 2 of you. So you and your partner have signatures for the multi-sig and you both have to sign off on transactions. But Casa can hold a 3rd key for you so that if one of you loses your access information, they can essentially sign off with the other person to access the wallet and to affect the transaction. And you can obviously increase the amount of participants in that, but it just gives you an added layer of potential security. There's also a company called Fedimint, which is run by this guy, Obi Nwosu. He's a British guy who ran a very early exchange in the Bitcoin space. And then he saw an opportunity to give communities multi-sig access. So the idea is that they have these members of the community that are trusted, that he calls guardians, and the guardians are the people that hold the keys for the multi-sig. So if you have, say, a village somewhere that would like to share Bitcoin communally, they can have trusted guardians to hold those keys who can be relied on to store them safely and who are people that they would trust with their Bitcoin. And he's actually doing a huge piece of work in deploying that in Africa, visiting lots of places where he's getting communities set up with Fedimint. It says actually, yeah, so this is the thing. So there's no single point of failure with multi-sig, which is the good part. The downside is that you need to trust other parties. So it does bring you a little bit back into that third party trust scenario. But it might be that, maybe your mum or your dad doesn't feel comfortable with storing their own Bitcoin and custodying it. So it could be a good solution for them. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how the public and private key and the Bitcoin addresses relate to each other. I don't know why I've done the image this way around. Maybe it should run from left to right. Anyway, if you imagine this is your storage of your Bitcoin, your hypothetical house, if you like, the private key is what you use to access that storage. Oh, sorry, I went back one. The private key is what generates the public key. And then the public key generates an address or multiple addresses. So the wallet in which relates to the public key can have one address or it can have multiple ones, and it can be configured so that that address will change every time. Generally speaking, the best practice for operating in Bitcoin is to set your wallet up so that it changes the public address every time. Because that way, what you're not doing is disclosing every single transaction that comes into a specific wallet. And just for privacy, security purposes, it's a much better way of doing it. From a cryptographic perspective, you can't generate the private key from one of these public addresses. So the private key will generate the public key, which would generate the addresses, but you can't reverse engineer that from an address back to a private key. So it's cryptographically secured in that way. The seed word is a series of words, and I think there are something like 2,500 possible seed words that can be used in the combination. And it's used as a way of having something that is more human readable rather than a 256-bit key, something that's human readable that you could potentially memorize or more easily write down and store. And what the seed word does is it generates your private key, which then generates your public key, which your wallet then, using that seed, generates all the addresses that you might have. So that seed phrase is something that can allow you to reconstitute all of this chain. So if you had a seed phrase and you delete the wallet, or you delete the software off of your computer, or you lose your cold storage, for example, you have a cold storage device, you can take that seed phrase and you can download a fresh wallet or buy a new storage device, and you can reconstitute that private key from the seed phrase. This is one of the things that I came across when I was doing the research that I found was actually quite concerning, that the difference between a seed phrase, a password, a passcode, a PIN is not always well defined, and they are sometimes used interchangeably. You will often see passcode and PIN when you're setting something up on a mobile device. Generally, what that means is that's a PIN or a password that protects the device. So it doesn't protect the seed phrase. So for example, if you downloaded a wallet and you put a PIN on it, somebody who gets hold of your phone wouldn't be able to access that wallet without having the PIN. But separately, you've stored your seed phrase, you've written down the 12 words or the 24 words that will reconstitute your private key, and you've stored that somewhere, and somebody gets hold of that. They can go and download any wallet, and they can use that seed phrase, if they have it, to reconstitute your private key and access your Bitcoin. So the passcode / PIN does not protect your seed phrase. It just protects the device. So if somebody steals it off you on the street or something like that. So that's just a word of caution there. The seed phrase is critical. So anytime you set up any kind of device to buy or store Bitcoin, you must write down your seed phrase. You must ideally store several copies in different places that you remember where they are. So it's not a safe place that you forget, because ideally you want backups, and the backups might be in different locations. Never, ever take a digital picture of your seed phrase, like with your phone. Never, ever, copy paste it or whatever it might be. Never, ever do that, because if your device is not secure for some reason or whatever, then somebody could get a copy of that. And for example, a lot of people have cloud, sending their photos to cloud automatically enabled. So if somebody has access to your cloud data, which for example, Apple would or Amazon would, in theory, they can access your Bitcoin if they decide to go and poke around and have a look. So never make a digital copy of that seed phrase. And I say that is a different thing to having it stored on a device. So the seed phrase will look something like this. It will just be a list of random words. That's actually just a screenshot of a grocery shopping list. So it looks rather like that. That's the reason why. It's important to explain the difference now between a seed phrase and a passphrase. So a passphrase is an additional phrase that protects your seed phrase. If you set this up with your seed phrase, the passphrase will protect your seed phrase if somebody gets hold of that backup somewhere. So if you've written your seed phrase down, you've stored it somewhere, but you've also created a password that you have stored separately to the seed phrase. If somebody gets hold of your seed phrase, they're not going to be able to access your Bitcoin without having that passphrase. However, if you enable a passphrase, you will not be able to recover your Bitcoins if you lose that passphrase. So it's like an additional set of security layered on top. It will make your backup of your seed phrase more secure. But every time you add a layer of security, this is why I've put these symbols down here, you're adding an additional layer of risk. So the risk is that you then lose your passphrase, and it's as good as though you'd lost your seed phrase. You will not be able to recover your seed phrase if you don't have your passphrase, if you have set up your passphrase. So that's just important to note. And be very careful of terminology as well. Generally speaking, passphrase is the word that's used, but some services use slightly different terminology for PIN, for password, for passphrase, and they don't make it explicitly clear what the impact is of selecting or not selecting that. So you just want to be mindful of that and make sure that you've understood, looking at the help pages of that service, what exactly that terminology they're using implies that you would be doing. So lastly, I just wanted to do a quick walk through a setup of a wallet. So the Blue wallet is quite a popular one that's used. So that's the reason why I've selected it. But there are lots of good wallets out there. Sparrow wallet is another good one. There are a few other different options, but this is just one that's quite simple to use for beginners, and it's easily accessible. So it's available on the iOS App Store and on the Google Play Store if you have an Android. The symbol looks like this with the Blue wallet. When you open the wallet up, it gives you the option here to add a wallet, or you can press the plus sign to do that. So that's what the first screen will look like. And then you go in here and you give your wallet a name. So I just did like a test thing here. And then you can select what you want this wallet for. For your purposes for now, I think Bitcoin is probably the easiest one. Lightning Network, we are going to touch on next year. So I'm going to actually have somebody come in who's an advocate for Lightning Labs to talk about the Lightning Network and run through how it works. But very briefly, it's just a layer 2 that sits on top of the Bitcoin main chain, and it allows you to transact more rapidly without having to write transactions onto the main chain or wait for the proof of work to be done so that that transaction is written to the block. So for day-to-day transactions like buying coffees and things like that, you would definitely want a Lightning wallet. But if you're setting something up for the first time and buying Bitcoin, then I would just select Bitcoin on here. So you go, give your wallet a name, select Bitcoin, you click create. And then once you've done it, you will get the option to write down your seed phrase, and your seed phrase will look like something like this. An important thing to note, it's not enough just to have the words written down. They have to be in the exact same order. So when you reconstitute your wallet, you're going to have to put those in exactly the same order that they're listed. So what you want to do at this point is to write this down, put a number next to each word that you're writing down. cross-check it, and I believe that when you set the Blue Wallet up, it does actually give you an option to cross-check it to make sure that you've correctly stored it. But either way, just cross-check it several times. Make more than one copy, so depending on how many copies you want to secure, and obviously decide how you want to physically secure these on the forward. And then once you've written it down, oh, that's it. You just click OK, I've written it down, and your wallet will be ready. So it's literally that simple to download one on your phone. Now, once you have the wallet on your phone, you will have to add Bitcoins to it. And there are a few ways of doing that. So if you can find somebody who's willing to just sell you some or give you some, then that's one way to start off. So they will usually pull up a QR code on their phone, and you will go in your wallet and either say buy or sell. So there'll be buttons for buy or sell, and you just scan their QR code and they can transfer Bitcoin to you. So that's peer-to-peer. That's one way of doing it. The other option is to use a service like an exchange. So a Coinbase is very popular, Kraken, obviously Binance as well as another one of the exchanges. So all of those exchanges offer services where you can create an account and you can buy your Bitcoin from the exchange. Most importantly, when you've done that, immediately you need to take those private keys off of that exchange and put them into your wallet. So once you've done the purchase on the exchange account, you just want to come off it or take the private keys and your Bitcoin off of that exchange, store it directly on your wallet, either your hot wallet or your cold storage. The other option as well, there are non-custodial services, which are just kind of like Bitcoin brokerages. So Bull Bitcoin is a very well-known one in Canada, but there are other ones as well that are used sort of across the globe. So find one that's reliable locally, and if you have questions, you can ask me, and I can suggest some that might be available in your region. But what you can do with those is you can essentially just fund them through your bank account. So you do a bank transfer to those services, and then you purchase the Bitcoin through them. And then again, you can just remove it and put it into self-custody from those services. In fact, most of them will have you put it directly into your wallet, as opposed to, so you would connect up your wallet to the service and it would go directly in your wallet. As they're non-custodial, they don't keep hold of that Bitcoin for you. So that's it. That is really, and I hope this has been helpful in simplifying it, because I think sometimes it seems very opaque. I will send the recording through and obviously all of the deck as well. I did actually do a link tree for all of the different social sites. So I'll send this out on the chat actually as soon as I stop sharing, and you can see all of the different social sites. We don't have much on there yet, but we will do in the next couple of weeks. So there'll be stuff coming out and obviously updates of any of the upcoming sessions. Further reading, so I've put a whole bunch of articles here on, I actually found a very good one on Forbes explaining self-custody, so that's a good one. Nunchuck, which was the service in Canada that I referenced, which is the self-custody one, and various other different services on here, different articles on here that talk about what we touched on today if you want to do some further reading. And I just wanted to end this presentation with, for those of you that are terrified now about losing your Bitcoins, this was a comment that Satoshi said: lost coins only make everyone else's coins worth slightly more. Think of it as a donation to everyone. So every time somebody loses their coins, obviously the supply gets smaller and smaller, which means that those that have some, the value of what they have is increased. And there are actually people in the Bitcoin community who don't make inheritance plans, because they just say, well, when I'm gone and my Bitcoin is no longer accessible, that's my gift to all of the other Bitcoin holders. So if that should happen to you by accident, that you lose your coins, maybe you can take some comfort in that sentiment. So lastly, I'm just going to stop recording and then just open up for questions if any of you guys have any additional questions. I'll stop.